They are the Imperium's golden sons, the exemplars of everything a space marine should be. The galaxy celebrates them as heroes, saviors, the very pinnacle of humanity's potential. But behind the propaganda, beneath the honor and glory, the Ultramarines live a truth too terrible to acknowledge. They are not heroes. They are victims. And their suffering is the price the Imperium demands for the lie it tells itself about what it means to serve. The funeral procession wound through the streets of Macrage's Hera, and nobody cheered. This was wrong. Brother-Sergeant Cassius Tiro thought as he marched in perfect lockstep with his battle brothers, bearing the casket of Captain Venetus of the 3rd Company. When Ultramarines died, the citizens of Ultramar were supposed to line the streets in their millions, weeping tears of gratitude, celebrating the fallen warrior's ascension to the Emperor's side. Children were supposed to throw flowers. Priests were supposed to sing hymns. The people were supposed to care. Instead, the streets were empty save for the required mourners. Administratum functionaries assigned to attend, their faces carefully neutral, their presence a bureaucratic obligation rather than genuine grief. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic thumping of ceramite boots on marble and the occasional rustle of parchment as a scribe recorded the proceedings for official records. Captain Venetus had died on Viridia Prime, holding a worthless chunk of rock against a Terranid splinter fleet for 73 days until reinforcements arrived. He had killed 14 Carnifexes in personal combat. He had led his company through 17 separate defensive actions without losing a single position. He had embodied every virtue the Codex Astartes demanded: courage, tactical brilliance, unwavering duty, and absolute devotion to the Imperium. And now he was being buried like administrative waste, attended by clerks who couldn't be bothered to look up from their data slates. Cassius had served for 147 years. He had seen the galaxy from one end to the other, fought on 1,000 battlefields, killed enemies whose names he'd long forgotten. He had watched brothers fall and new recruits rise to replace them in the endless cycle of war. But this empty, meaningless ceremony, this was somehow worse than any battlefield death, because it meant nobody cared. The procession reached the Mausoleum of Honored Dead, a structure so vast it had its own atmospheric processors. Inside, crypts stretched for kilometers in every direction, each one containing the remains of an Ultramarine who had fallen in service to the Emperor. Cassius had walked these halls before, had seen the names carved into adamantium plates: heroes of the Horus Heresy, veterans of the First Tyrannic War, champions of the Gothic War, warriors whose deeds should have echoed through eternity. Most of the names were worn smooth by time, illegible, forgotten. They laid Captain Venetus to rest in Crypt 773C, subsection 44, level 19. A priest of the Ultramarines recited the traditional prayers, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. Then it was over. The functionaries filed out. The priests departed. The Ultramarines stood in silence for exactly 60 seconds, the prescribed mourning period, then turned and marched away. Cassius lingered. He shouldn't have. It violated protocol. But something made him stay, staring at the captain's name carved into fresh adamantium: Venetus. Captain, 3rd Company, fell at Viridia Prime 999 and 41, service to the Emperor 201 years, 201 years of service, reduced to 2 lines of text in a crypt that would eventually be forgotten like all the others. Brother, Sergeant, you're out of position. Cassius turned to find Chaplain Orestes watching him, the skull-faced helmet making the chaplain's expression unreadable but his tone carrying clear disapproval. Forgive me, Chaplain, I was reflecting. On what? On whether it matters. Any of it, if we die and nobody even notices. Orestes was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully measured. You're experiencing doubt, brother. This is a symptom of exhaustion. You've been active for too long without proper spiritual maintenance. I'm assigning you to 6 weeks of devotional meditation. That's not what I need, Chaplain. It's not about need, it's about protocol. Doubt is a virus, Brother-Sergeant. Left untreated, it spreads. You'll report to the meditation chambers immediately, and if I refuse." Orestes' hand moved to the Crozius Arcanum at his belt. "Then I'll ensure your compliance through other means. You're too valuable to lose to spiritual corruption. The choice is yours. 6 weeks of voluntary meditation, or I render you unconscious and you wake up having already completed 6 weeks of involuntary meditation. Either way, the result is the same." Cassius looked at the chaplain, at the weapon, at the empty crypt behind him. He thought about resisting, thought about demanding answers, thought about asking the questions that had been building in his mind for decades. But he was an Ultramarine. Ultramarines followed the Codex Astartes, and the Codex was clear: when a superior officer gives an order, you obey. "I'll report immediately, Chaplain." "Good. The Emperor protects, brother. The Emperor protects." Cassius echoed and marched toward the meditation chambers, his doubt carefully filed away but not quite extinguished. The meditation chamber was a cell. They called it a sanctum, dressed it up with devotional icons and prayer inscriptions, but it was fundamentally a cell. 3 meters by 3 meters, no windows, a single door that locked from the outside. Inside, a prayer bench, a copy of the Codex Astartes, devotional texts, and absolutely nothing else. Cassius entered, the door sealed. He was alone with his thoughts and the Emperor's word. The first day, he prayed. The words came automatically after 147 years' prayers to the Emperor, prayers to Robot Guilliman, prayers for strength and clarity and unwavering faith. He recited passages from the Codex, analyzed tactical scenarios, reviewed his combat history for errors that needed correction. The second day, he prayed again, the same prayers, the same passages. The routine was comforting, familiar, exactly what an Ultramarine should do when facing spiritual uncertainty. The third day, he started to think, and once he started, he couldn't stop. He thought about Captain Venetus, about the empty streets and the uncaring functionaries, about 200 years of service ending in a forgotten crypt. He thought about all the battles he'd fought, all the worlds he'd saved, all the enemies he'd killed. He tried to remember any of them mattering beyond the immediate tactical objective. He couldn't. Ultramarines saved worlds, but the worlds didn't stay saved. They'd liberate a planet from chaos, and 20 years later it would fall to orcs. They'd purge a Genestealer infestation, and 30 years later Tyranids would consume the whole system. They'd die by the hundreds, the thousands, and the galaxy just kept getting worse. He thought about recruitment, about the boys taken from Ultramar's worlds, subjected to the brutal transformation process that turned baseline humans into space marines. He remembered his own transformation, the pain, the surgeries, the psychological conditioning, the systematic removal of everything that made him human and its replacement with something else. They told you it was an honor, that you were being elevated, that you would become humanity's greatest defender. They didn't tell you what you lost. They couldn't, because if recruits knew the truth, none of them would volunteer. Cassius remembered being Cassius Tiro, a boy of 11 from a farming community on Ultramar's outer colonies. He remembered his mother's face. Or rather, he remembered that he'd once had a mother and that he'd once loved her. But the actual memory had been degraded by decades of psycho conditioning until all that remained was abstract knowledge without emotional content. He remembered his father teaching him to shoot, remembered friends, remembered dreams of becoming a pilot, of seeing the galaxy, of living a life that mattered. Then the recruiters had come, tested him, found him genetically compatible, and his parents, who loved him, who'd raised him, who'd wanted nothing but the best for him, had surrendered him without hesitation because refusing the Ultramarines was refusing the Emperor, and refusing the Emperor was heresy. He'd been 11 years old. They'd cut him open and rebuilt him, implanted him with 19 additional organs, subjected him to hypno-conditioning and psycho-indoctrination, trained him for a decade in warfare and nothing else. By the time the transformation was complete, Cassius Tiro the boy had ceased to exist. There was only Brother Cassius, Ultramarine, servant of the Emperor, weapon in human form. The psychological conditioning was supposed to make you accept this, was designed to fill the void where your humanity had been with devotion to the Emperor and the Codex Astartes. And it worked. Had worked for 147 years, keeping Cassius focused, faithful, functional. But now, alone in the meditation chamber with nothing to distract him, he felt the conditioning slipping. Felt the questions it had suppressed bubbling up from somewhere deep in his psyche that hadn't been quite completely erased. What if the transformation hadn't been elevation but mutilation? What if they hadn't made him better but simply different, just functional enough to serve the Imperium's purposes? What if everything he'd done, every battle he'd fought, every brother he'd watched die, had been for nothing more than sustaining a civilization that was slowly dying regardless? He tried to pray these thoughts away, recited the litany of devotion, the oath of moment, the catechism of duty. But the words felt empty now, mechanical, just sounds with no substance. On the 5th day, Cassius stopped praying entirely. He sat on the stone floor of the meditation chamber and allowed himself, for the first time in 147 years, to simply think without the filter of conditioning and doctrine. And what he thought was this: the Ultramarines were miserable, not in the way baseline humans experienced misery. The Ultramarines didn't have the emotional capacity for conventional unhappiness. The transformation process had removed most of their ability to feel ordinary emotions. They couldn't experience joy or contentment or simple pleasure. They felt duty, they felt purpose, and they felt a vague, abstract loyalty to concepts like honor and service. But underneath the conditioning, underneath the psycho-indoctrination and the genetic modification, there was still something human. Some fragment of the boys they'd been, buried so deep that most never even noticed it existed. And that fragment was screaming. Cassius realized he'd been hearing it for decades. The scream was in every brother who threw himself at the enemy with slightly more enthusiasm than tactical doctrine required. Seeking death without admitting he was seeking death. It was in the chaplain's constant vigilance against doubt and despair, their need to constantly reinforce faith, because without reinforcement, that faith would collapse. It was in the empty streets during Captain Venetus's funeral, because even the citizens of Ultramar, who worshipped the Ultramarines more than any other chapter, had grown tired of endless funerals for warriors fighting in wars that never ended. The Ultramarines were the Imperium's greatest success story. The Codex-compliant chapter, the exemplars of everything a space marine should be. And they were all slowly drowning in the fundamental meaninglessness of their existence. On the 7th day, the door opened. Chaplain Orestes entered, his skull-faced helmet gleaming in the chamber's dim light. Brother-Sergeant Cassius, your meditation period has been completed. How do you feel? Cassius stood, his massive frame unfolding with practiced precision. He looked at the chaplain, at the symbols of faith and duty inscribed on his armor, at the Crozius Arcanum that could kill with a single blow. He thought about telling the truth, thought about explaining what he'd realized, sharing the terrible clarity that had emerged from a week of enforced solitude. But he was an Ultramarine. Ultramarines followed the Codex. And the Codex was clear: when doubt threatened the chapter's cohesion, you suppressed it. I feel restored, Chaplain. My faith is renewed. I'm ready to return to duty. Orestes studied him for a long moment. Cassius kept his expression neutral, his bearing perfect, his body language communicating nothing but absolute confidence and devotion. Good, the chaplain said finally. You're needed. The 3rd Company needs a new captain. Command has selected you. Cassius felt something cold settle in his chest. Captain. It should have been an honor, the culmination of a century and a half of service. Recognition of his skill, his devotion, his worthiness. Instead, it felt like a sentence. I'm honored to serve, Chaplain. The Emperor protects, Captain Cassius. The Emperor protects, Cassius repeated, and followed the chaplain out of the meditation chamber, back into a war that would never end. commanding brothers who would eventually die meaningless deaths in forgotten battles, until he too ended up in a crypt with his name carved in adamantium that would eventually be worn smooth by time and forgotten by everyone. The third company was a machine, and Captain Cassius was now responsible for maintaining it. 100 Space Marines, organized into 10 squads of 10, each warrior a genetically modified transhuman killing machine worth more than entire planetary defense forces. They could deploy anywhere in the galaxy within days, crush enemies that would overwhelm conventional forces, and operate independently for years without resupply. They were magnificent. They were terrifying. They were completely and utterly expendable. Cassius reviewed his company's records in the captain's sanctum, a larger cell than the meditation chamber, but still fundamentally a cell, decorated with tactical displays and company honors, and the preserved skulls of previous third company captains. The walls were covered in names. Every brother who'd served in the third company over its 10,000-year history, thousands upon thousands of names, each one representing a transhuman warrior who'd been transformed, trained, deployed, and killed in service to an Imperium that barely remembered they'd existed. Current roster 90, 4 brothers out of 100 authorized, 6 killed at Viridia Prime, not yet replaced. The replacements would come. New brothers finishing their transformation process, eager scouts promoted to full battle, brothers, transfers from other companies. The machine would maintain itself, grinding fresh meat into the same gears that had consumed their predecessors. Cassius's door chimed. Enter. Brother Theron stepped through, his armor still bearing scorches from the Viridia Prime campaign. The brother had served in the third company for 37 years, fought in 12 major campaigns, earned 17 honors. His expression was carefully neutral, but Cassius, having spent decades reading the subtle body language of transhuman warriors, could see the exhaustion underneath. Captain, congratulations on your elevation. Thank you, brother. What can I do for you? Theron hesitated, which was unusual. Ultramarines didn't hesitate. They acted with decisive confidence, according to the Codex's teachings. Hesitation suggested doubt, and doubt suggested spiritual corruption. Permission to speak freely, Captain. Granted. I've been assigned to the recruitment assessment team for this cycle. We'll be visiting Macrage's secondary colonies, testing children for genetic compatibility, selecting candidates for transformation. Theron paused. I need to know if you've ever had doubts about the process. The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. This was the kind of conversation that could end with both of them in meditation chambers. Or worse, undergoing corrective surgery. But Cassius had spent a week thinking about these exact questions. And he was tired of lying. What kind of doubts? He asked carefully. About whether we're doing them a favor. The recruits. We tell them it's an honor, that they're being elevated, that they'll become heroes. But we don't tell them what they're losing. We don't tell them about the conditioning, the erasure of their old selves, the fact that they'll spend the rest of their lives, centuries, maybe, fighting in wars that never end for an Imperium that doesn't even know their names. Theron's voice was steady, but Cassius heard the strain underneath. This brother had reached the same conclusions, had felt the same fractures in the conditioning that held their minds together. What do you think we should tell them? Cassius asked. The truth. That transformation into a space marine isn't elevation but obliteration. That the boy dies so the weapon can be born. That they'll never know love or joy or peace, or any of the things that make life worth living. That they'll exist in a state of permanent warfare until they're killed, and then they'll be forgotten like everyone else. And if we told them that, how many do you think would volunteer? None, Theron admitted. None of them would choose this if they knew what it actually was. Then why are you asking me about doubt? You already know the answer. Theron was silent for a long moment. Then, because I'm tired, Captain. I'm so tired, and I can't be tired because Ultramarines don't get tired. We endure it, or we persevere. We maintain perfect discipline and perfect faith no matter what. But I'm tired anyway, and I thought maybe if you'd experienced the same thing, maybe it would mean I wasn't broken. That this was normal. That I could. Brother Theron, Cassius interrupted. What you're describing is spiritual exhaustion. It's a recognized condition. The solution is meditation, prayer, and renewed focus on your duties. If necessary, we can arrange corrective conditioning to restore your faith. He watched Theron's expression shift. Hope dying, resignation settling in. The brother straightened to attention. I understand, Captain. Thank you for your time. Brother Theron, before you go. Cassius stood, moved to face the warrior directly. You're not broken. You're experiencing what every Ultramarine experiences eventually. The difference is most of them die before they have time to process it. You've survived long enough to see the pattern, to recognize what we actually are. That's not weakness. That's clarity. Clarity that serves no purpose. No, it doesn't. Cassius put a hand on Theron's shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood that transcended rank. But it's real, and sometimes knowing you're not alone in feeling it is enough. You'll do your duty. You'll recruit the next generation. You'll train them and watch them die, just like we've all watched brothers die. And it will hurt in ways that our conditioning can't quite suppress. But you'll endure, because that's what Ultramarines do. Is that supposed to be comforting, Captain? No, it's supposed to be true. Theron nodded slowly. Thank you, Captain. I'll complete my assignment. He left, and Cassius stood alone in his sanctum, surrounded by the names of the dead, wondering how many of them had experienced the same doubts, the same exhaustion, the same terrible clarity about what they'd become. The third company deployed to Thrax's saw 3 weeks later. Orc incursion, standard cleans, and purge operation, estimated duration 4 months. The kind of campaign Cassius had fought hundreds of times, brutal, straightforward, winnable. They dropped from orbit in Thunderhawks, ceramite rain crashing through Thrax's size-polluted atmosphere, hitting the surface in a coordinated assault that would have impressed military scholars across the galaxy. Tactical Squad Praxis established the beachhead. Devastator Squad Cato provided fire support. Assault Squad Leonis performed vertical envelopment. It was textbook Codex Astartes doctrine, executed with the precision that only centuries of training and genetic enhancement could provide. The Orcs never stood a chance. Cassius directed the battle from the front line, because that's what Ultramarine captains did. Led by example, demonstrated courage under fire, showed their brothers that no enemy was too fearsome to face. He killed 17 Orcs personally in the first hour, his power sword carving through green flesh and crude armor with contemptuous ease. Around him, the third company performed perfectly. Every brother knew his role, executed his assigned tactics, maintained proper spacing and fire discipline. They moved like a single organism, each component perfectly synchronized with the others. And Cassius felt absolutely nothing. He should have felt pride in his company's performance. Should have felt satisfaction at the enemy's destruction. Should have felt something watching his brothers demonstrate their superiority over inferior opponents. Instead, he felt hollow, empty, going through motions that had stopped meaning anything decades ago. An Orc Nob, massive, armored, wielding a power claw that could tear through ceramite, charged directly at him. Cassius killed it with 3 precise strikes: leg, chest, throat. The Nob collapsed, its death roar cut short, adding one more corpse to the thousands accumulating across the battlefield. Third Company advanced to Sector 7-7. Cassius voxed. Tactical squads maintain formation. Devastators provide overwatch. Assault squads sweep flanks for remaining hostiles. They advanced. They maintained formation. They swept flanks. They killed everything in their path. By the campaign's end 4 months later, the Third Company had eliminated an estimated 47 Salos and Orcs with the loss of only 3 battle brothers. Imperial propagandists would call it a triumph. The Administratum would file a report noting acceptable casualties. The citizens of Thrax's Exer would rebuild their factories and resume production of whatever the Imperium required from their worthless chunk of rock. And Captain Cassius would move on to the next deployment, and the next, and the next, in an endless cycle of violence that accomplished nothing except perpetuating itself. During the campaign, he'd lost Brother Marcus to a lucky orc shoot-a-burst that found the vulnerable joint in his neck seal. He'd lost Brother Cordovan when a crude orc bomb, more improvised explosive than actual grenade, detonated at point-blank range, shredding the brother's armor and the flesh beneath. He'd lost Brother Theron, the warrior who'd asked about doubt, when an orc Warboss's power claw had punched through his chest plate and torn out his primary heart. Theron's last words, transmitted over the Vox before his secondary heart failed, were, "Thank you, Captain, for telling me the truth." Cassius recovered the bodies personally, sealed them in stasis caskets for transport back to Macragge, filed the appropriate death notifications, recommended replacements, wrote commendations noting each brother's bravery, skill, and devotion to duty. Then he went to his quarters and sat in silence, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of 147 years pressing down on him like a physical force. The door chimed. Cassius almost ignored it, wanted to ignore it, wanted to sit in the dark and let the exhaustion finally consume him. But he was an Ultramarine captain. Captains didn't get to indulge in despair. Enter. Chaplain Orestes stepped through, still wearing his skull-faced helmet, still carrying his Crozius Arcanum. "Captain, I've received concerning reports about your mental state." "From whom?" "Multiple sources. Brothers noting your detachment, your lack of engagement beyond minimum tactical requirements, your failure to provide the expected emotional leadership." I completed the mission. The third company performed within acceptable parameters. What more is required? Joy, Captain. Pride. The satisfaction of victory over the Emperor's enemies. You're going through the motions, but you're not present. That's a symptom of advanced spiritual corruption. Cassius looked at the chaplain, at the symbols of faith covering his armor, at the weapon designed to kill recalcitrant space marines. "Chaplain, answer me honestly. How many brothers have you seen experience what you're calling spiritual corruption?" Orestes was silent for a moment. "Many. It's not uncommon among veterans who've served for multiple centuries. The conditioning begins to degrade. Doubts emerge. Faith wavers. And what's your success rate in correcting it?" "That's classified information, which means the success rate is low. Which means most brothers who reach this point don't recover. Which means you're here to determine whether I need corrective intervention or whether I'm too far gone and need to be retired." "Captain, how many Ultramarines has the chapter executed for spiritual corruption, Chaplain?" "Over 10,000 years, hundreds, thousands. Warriors who served loyally for centuries until they finally broke under the weight of endless, meaningless war. And your solution was to kill them rather than admit that maybe the system itself is the problem." The Crozius Arcanum activated, crackling with power field energy. "Captain Cassius, you're demonstrating advanced ideological corruption. I'm placing you under arrest pending full psycho, evaluation, and corrective conditioning. Resist, and I'll render you unconscious for your own protection." Cassius stood slowly, his power armor's servos humming. He was larger than the chaplain, more experienced in combat, and in his current state, he honestly didn't care whether he lived or died. "Do it, then," he said quietly. "Execute me like you've executed how many others? Add my name to the list of brothers who served faithfully until they made the mistake of noticing that none of it matters. Show me the mercy of an honorable death so I don't have to spend another century grinding through this misery." Orestes hesitated. The Crozius remained active, but he didn't swing. "You're not the first to reach this point," the chaplain said finally. "You're not even the first this year. The chapter has protocols for this exact situation. You're not broken, Captain. You're worn down. Like a blade that's seen too much combat, we can repair you, recondition you, give you back your faith and purpose. by erasing whatever's left of who I am and replacing it with someone else. That's not repair, Chaplain. That's murder disguised as medicine. It's survival. Without faith, without purpose, an Ultramarine is just a weapon without direction. Dangerous, unstable, useless to the chapter and the Imperium. Better to reshape you into something functional than to lose you entirely. Cassius felt a strange calm settling over him, a kind of peace he hadn't experienced in decades. Then do it. Recondition me. Erase Cassius and create whatever servile tool you need. Because I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend it matters. I can't watch more brothers die for nothing. I can't recruit more children and lie to them about what they're becoming. I can't be Captain Cassius, exemplar of Ultramarine virtue, when I know it's all just a mask covering the screaming void where our humanity used to be. The chaplain deactivated his Crozius. You'll report to the Medica facilities immediately. The reconditioning process will take approximately 6 months. When it's complete, you'll resume your duties with restored faith and renewed purpose. And if I refuse, then I'll have you executed for heresy. Quickly, cleanly, with all honors. You've earned that much. Cassius looked at the chaplain, at the choice being offered death or transformation into someone else. Either way, Captain Cassius Tiro would cease to exist. I'll report for reconditioning, he said finally. But chaplain, answer me one question first. Honestly, have you ever experienced what I'm feeling now? This exhaustion, this doubt, this fundamental understanding that we're all trapped in a system that exists only to perpetuate itself. Orestes was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, more human than Cassius had ever heard from a chaplain. Every day, Captain. Every single day for 247 years. Then why do you continue? Because the alternative is admitting that my entire existence has been meaningless, that I've wasted nearly 3 centuries serving a lie, that the boy I was died for nothing. I can't accept that. So I enforce the faith I no longer have, and I recondition brothers who've reached the same conclusions I reached decades ago. And I tell myself that I'm preserving something valuable instead of simply perpetuating suffering. The admission hung in the air between them. 2 transhuman warriors, each broken in their own way, bound by duty to a cause neither one believed in anymore. The Emperor protects, Cassius said quietly. The Emperor protects, Orestes echoed. Now report for reconditioning. That's an order. Cassius marched toward the Medici facilities, toward the machines and chirurgeons who would cut into his brain and reshape his consciousness. And he wondered if the new version of Captain Cassius would even remember this conversation or if it would be filed away with all the other inconvenient truths the chapter had decided were too dangerous to acknowledge. The reconditioning took 8 months, not 6. Apparently, Cassius's case was more severe than initially assessed. They used a combination of techniques: psycho, surgery to remove or suppress problematic neural pathways, chemical conditioning to rebalance his neurochemistry, hypno, indoctrination to reinforce proper thought patterns, and extensive prayer and meditation to rebuild his faith from the ground up. When it was over, Captain Cassius Tiro resumed his duties. He commanded the 3rd Company through 12 more campaigns over the next 37 years. He recruited new brothers to replace those killed in combat. He wrote commendations and filed casualty reports, and performed all the duties expected of an Ultramarine captain. He never questioned orders, never expressed doubt, never showed anything but absolute devotion to the Emperor and the Codex Astartes. And somewhere deep inside, buried beneath layers of reconditioning and psycho-surgery, the original Cassius Tiro still existed, still remembered, still screamed silently at the injustice of it all. But that scream was distant now, muffled, barely audible over the constant reinforcement of faith and duty that the reconditioning had installed. Most days, Captain Cassius didn't even notice it was there. On his 184th year of service, Cassius was killed on a worthless moon whose name he'd never learned. fighting Chaos cultists who would have been easily destroyed by conventional Imperial Guard forces if the Administratum had bothered to send them. He died holding a position that didn't need holding, buying time for civilians to evacuate from a colony that would be reoccupied by Chaos within 6 months. His death was officially recorded as heroic, glorious, a perfect example of Ultramarine devotion. His body was never recovered. Orbital bombardment sterilized the moon 3 hours after his last Vox transmission, reducing everything on the surface. Chaos cultists, civilians, and Captain Cassius Tiro to radioactive ash. No funeral procession. No crypt in the mausoleum of honored dead. No carving of his name in adamantium. The third company received a replacement captain within 2 weeks. A promising young warrior named Antonius, fresh from the 10th Company, eager to prove himself. He reviewed the company's records, studied the battles they'd fought, learned the names of his new brothers. He noticed Captain Cassius's entry 184 years of service, dozens of commendations, exemplary record, no mentions of doubt or reconditioning. Those records were sealed, classified, deemed unnecessary for operational purposes. Captain Antonius filed away the information and focused on his duties. He had a company to command, battles to fight, brothers to lead. There was no time for reflection on those who'd come before. The machine ground on. Recruiter. Sergeant Gallius stood before a classroom of 11-year-old boys on Macrage's secondary colony, Connor's Hope. The children looked at him with wide eyes, seeing a transhuman warrior in full ceremonial armor, a living legend, a representative of humanity's greatest defenders. "Who among you wishes to serve the Emperor?" Gallius asked, his voice amplified by his armor's Vox system. Every hand shot up. Of course they did. These children had been raised on stories of Ultramarine glory, fed propaganda about the honor of service, taught from birth that becoming a space marine was the highest calling imaginable. "Good," Gallius said. "You'll be tested for genetic compatibility. Those who pass will begin the transformation process immediately. You'll become stronger, faster, more capable than any baseline human. You'll fight the Emperor's enemies across the galaxy. You'll become heroes." He didn't tell them about the pain, about the surgeries that would cut them open and rebuild them, about the psychological conditioning that would erase who they were and replace them with something else, about the wars that never ended, the brothers they'd watched die, the slow realization that their service was just feeding bodies into a machine that existed only to consume more bodies. He didn't tell them because telling them would violate protocol, because the Ultramarines needed new recruits, because the machine required fuel. One boy raised his hand, small, dark-haired, with eyes that reminded Gallius uncomfortably of his own reflection from nearly 2 centuries ago. "Yes," Gallius asked. "Sir, what's it like?" Being a space marine, Gallius opened his mouth to deliver the standard response. "It's glorious, honorable, the fulfillment of every warrior's dream." But something stopped him. Some fragment of memory, buried deep of another conversation, another recruit sergeant who might have asked himself the same questions. "It's necessary," Gallius said finally. "That's what it is. Necessary. The Imperium needs us. Humanity needs us. Whether we want to serve or not is irrelevant. We serve because the alternative is watching everything fall apart." "But do you like it?" The question was innocent. The boy genuinely wanted to know. Had no idea he was asking something that could get Gallius investigated for spiritual corruption. "Like is irrelevant," Gallius said. "We don't serve because we like it. We serve because we must. That's what being a space marine means, doing what's necessary regardless of personal feelings. Now, who's ready for genetic testing?" The hands went up again. All of them, including the dark-haired boy who'd asked the question. Gallius processed them efficiently. Took blood samples, ran genetic analysis, identified 7 candidates with appropriate markers, informed their parents, who surrendered their children without hesitation because refusing was heresy. The children looked excited, looked honored, looked like they thought they were about to embark on the greatest adventure of their lives. Gallius wanted to tell them the truth, wanted to grab the dark-haired boy and shake him and scream, "Run. Run as far and as fast as you can, because if you submit to this, you'll die. Maybe not physically, but everything that makes you who you are will be cut away and burned and replaced with something that can't love, can't feel joy, can't do anything except kill and die and pretend it matters." But he didn't, because he was an Ultramarine, because protocol demanded compliance, because the machine needed fuel, and he was part of the machine, had been for 189 years, and would be until the day he died, or was reconditioned into something that could no longer remember why any of this was wrong. "Congratulations," he told the 7 children. "You've been selected. Your transformation begins tomorrow. The Emperor protects." "The Emperor protects!" they shouted back, their young voices full of excitement and hope, and all the things that would be systematically destroyed over the next decade. Gallius watched them file out with their parents, chattering about their upcoming adventure, about the glory they would achieve, about the enemies they would vanquish. Then he returned to his quarters, sat in the darkness, and tried to remember what it felt like to be 11 years old and full of hope. He couldn't. That boy, whoever he'd been, was long dead, had been dead for 189 years. And the thing wearing his modified body was just a weapon pretending to be human, going through the motions of a life that had stopped meaning anything so long ago that even the memory of meaning had faded. The door chimed. "Enter," Gallius said, not bothering to activate the lights. Chaplain Orestes stepped through. Of course it was Orestes. It was always Orestes, making his rounds, checking for signs of spiritual corruption, maintaining the fiction that Ultramarines were noble heroes rather than broken weapons held together by conditioning and duty. "Brother Gallius, I've reviewed your recruitment session today. You deviated from protocol." "How?" "You were asked what it's like being a space marine. Your response was technically accurate but lacking proper enthusiasm. You're supposed to inspire recruits, not just inform them." They were inspired. All 7 accepted selection. "Yes, but your tone suggested doubt, hesitation. That's concerning. Combined with your extended service record, 189 years is well past the point where most brothers begin experiencing degradation. I'm recommending you for spiritual maintenance. More reconditioning. Preventive maintenance." Orestes corrected. "Before the problem becomes acute. You've seen what happens when doubt is allowed to fester. Captain Cassius nearly required termination before reconditioning salvaged him. I'd rather not lose another veteran to spiritual corruption if early intervention can prevent it." Gallius looked at the chaplain's skull-faced helmet, at the symbols of faith and duty, at the Crozius that could kill him in a single blow. "And if I refuse?" "The same options as always. Voluntary reconditioning or involuntary reconditioning after I render you unconscious. Your choice. Some choice. It's the only choice any of us have, brother. Submit to the system that sustains us or be terminated by it. Those are the options. They've always been the options. They'll always be the options." Gallius stood, his armor servos humming. He was tired. So impossibly, unbearably tired in ways that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "When does the maintenance begin?" "Tomorrow. You'll be replaced on the recruitment detail by Brother Maxim. The procedure should take 4 to 6 months, depending on how deeply the corruption has set. And then I'll go back to recruiting children, lying to them about what they're becoming, watching them die decades later in battles that accomplish nothing, until the conditioning degrades again, and I need more maintenance, in an endless cycle that continues until I'm finally killed or damaged beyond repair." "Yes," Orestes said simply. "That's what we are, Brother Gallius. That's what we've always been. Weapons that require periodic maintenance. Tools that serve a function. We gave up the right to be anything else the moment we accepted transformation." "The boy. You were died so the weapon you became could serve the Emperor. That was the bargain. That's always been the bargain. It's not fair." "No, it's not. But fairness is a luxury for civilians. We're Ultramarines. We don't get luxuries. We get duty and honor and the knowledge that our suffering sustains an imperium that might collapse without us. That's supposed to be enough. Is it enough for you, chaplain? Orestes was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 2.5 centuries of service. No, brother. It hasn't been enough for a very long time. But I endure because the alternative is admitting that I wasted my entire existence serving a lie. And I'm too much of a coward to face that truth. So I enforce the system, and I recondition brothers who've reached the same conclusions I've reached. And I tell myself that I'm preserving something valuable instead of just perpetuating suffering. That's what Captain Cassius said before his reconditioning. I remember. I was there. And I'm telling you the same thing I told him. You'll report for reconditioning, or I'll make you report for reconditioning. Either way, the result is the same. You'll be repaired, restored to functional status, and returned to duty. Because that's what the chapter needs. What the Imperium needs. What the Emperor demands. Gallius looked at the chaplain, at the broken warrior hiding behind the skull-faced helmet, enforcing a system he no longer believed in because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The Emperor protects, Gallius said quietly. The Emperor protects, Orestes echoed. Now report to the Medica facilities. That's an order. Gallius walked toward the medical wing, toward the machines that would cut into his brain and rebuild his consciousness. And he wondered how many times the chapter had done this. How many brothers had reached this point of exhaustion and doubt? How many had been reconditioned? How many had been terminated when reconditioning failed? Hundreds. Thousands. 10,000 years of service meant 10,000 years of brothers breaking under the weight of meaningless war, being repaired and returned to duty until they broke again in an endless cycle of suffering disguised as glory. This was what it meant to be an Ultramarine. Not honor, not glory, not heroism. Just suffering maintained through conditioning and duty, until death finally provided the mercy of oblivion. 5 years after Gallius underwent his second reconditioning, the third company deployed to a nameless asteroid in the eastern fringe, responding to reports of a minor tyrannid infestation that conventional forces couldn't handle. The mission was straightforward. Eliminate the tyrannid organisms, sterilize the asteroid, return to Macragge. Estimated duration 3 weeks. Expected casualties minimal. They arrived to find not a minor infestation, but the vanguard of a splinter fleet. Millions of tyrannid organisms, with more arriving every hour through spore drops from orbit. The asteroid's civilian population, 27,000 miners and their families, was already 90% consumed. Captain Hadrian, who'd replaced Captain Antonius after Antonius was killed on some other worthless rock, made the tactical assessment the position was untenable. Evacuation was impossible. The only option was fighting withdrawal and orbital bombardment. All squads, fall back to the extraction point, Hadrian ordered. We'll sterilize from orbit. There's nothing here worth dying for. But Brother-Sergeant Paulus, commanding Tactical Squad Victress, saw something on his auspex that made him hesitate. 17 heat signatures in a sealed bunker beneath the mining facility. 17 civilians still alive, trapped, waiting for rescue that would never come if the Ultramarines withdrew. Captain, Paulus voxed. I've got survivors. Requesting permission to attempt extraction. Negative. There's no time. We're already behind the withdrawal schedule. Those civilians are dead whether we extract them or not. Fall back with the rest of the company. Paulus looked at his tactical display, at the 17 signatures, at the tyrannid swarm closing in from all directions. The captain was right. Tactically, strategically, attempting extraction was pointless. Those civilians would die whether the Ultramarines saved them today or abandoned them to orbital bombardment. Every instinct, every piece of training, every line of the Codex Astartes said obey orders, maintain discipline, preserve the chapter's strength for battles that actually mattered. But something in Paulus, some fragment that hadn't been completely erased by transformation and conditioning, couldn't accept that, couldn't walk away, couldn't let 17 people die without even trying to save them. "A squad victress on me," he ordered. "We're going for the survivors." "Brother? Sergeant? That's a direct violation of—" "I know what it is," Paulus interrupted. "Anyone who wants to follow protocol, fall back with the captain. I'm going for those civilians. Alone if necessary." 9 battle brothers followed him. Not because protocol demanded it, not because the codex authorized it, but because somewhere in their psycho-conditioned minds, in the fragments of humanity that even genetic modification couldn't quite erase, they agreed that 17 lives were worth the risk. They fought through 3 kilometers of tyrannid, infested tunnels, expending ammunition at a rate that violated every resource management protocol, taking damage that would require extensive repair once they returned to Macragge. They reached the bunker, breached it, found 17 terrified civilians, men, women, children, who'd been waiting for 5 days for rescue they'd stopped believing would come. Ultramarines. One of them whispered and started weeping. Paulus had been a space marine for 97 years. He'd fought on 40 different worlds, killed thousands of enemies, lost dozens of brothers. He'd seen every variation of human suffering the galaxy could produce. And in all that time, he'd never felt anything beyond abstract concern for civilian casualties. But looking at these 17 people, seeing the hope and gratitude in their eyes, he felt something crack in his conditioning, felt something human pushing through the layers of psycho-indoctrination and genetic modification. "We've got you," he said. "Stay close. We're getting you out." The extraction was a nightmare. Tyrannid organisms swarmed from every direction, forcing the Ultramarines into a fighting retreat that cost them half their ammunition and left 3 brothers with critical damage to their armor. Brother Tilos lost an arm to a Tyrannid warrior's bone sword. Brother Crassus took a acid spray to the chest that ate through his ceramite and started dissolving the flesh beneath. But they made it, fought their way back to the extraction point with all 17 civilians intact, loaded them onto the waiting Thunderhawk, and lifted off just as the orbital bombardment commenced, turning the asteroid into molten slag. Captain Hadrian was waiting when they returned to the battle barge. "Brother, Sergeant Paulus, you violated a direct order. You risked the lives of your squad and compromised the company's tactical position. You're under arrest for insubordination and dereliction of duty." Paulus removed his helmet, meeting the captain's gaze directly. "Yes, sir. I understand. Do you? Do you understand that the 17 civilians you saved aren't worth the damage to Imperial resources? That those people will live mediocre lives, contribute minimally to the Imperium, and eventually die forgotten, while the ammunition you expended could have killed hundreds more enemies? That by prioritizing individual lives over strategic objectives, you demonstrated exactly the kind of sentimental thinking that the transformation process is designed to eliminate." "Yes, sir. I understand all of that. Then why did you do it?" Paulus was silent for a moment. "Then, because they were there, sir. Because they were alive, and we could save them, and I couldn't just leave them. I know that's not what the Codex teaches. I know it violates every principle of strategic resource management. But they were there, and they were people, and saving people is supposed to be what we do. Isn't it?" Hadrian stared at him. Around them, the other brothers of Third Company watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen when an Ultramarine admitted that he'd prioritized compassion over duty. "You're relieved of command," Hadrian said finally. "You'll undergo full psycho-evaluation and reconditioning. If you're salvageable, you'll be returned to duty. If not, you know what happens." "Yes, sir. Take him to the Medica," Hadrian ordered the guards. As they led Paulus away, one of the rescued civilians, a woman holding her daughter, called out, Thank you for saving us! May the Emperor bless you." Paulus turned back, meeting her eyes. And for the first time in 97 years, he smiled. Not the artificial expression of duty fulfilled, but a genuine smile born from the understanding that he'd done something that actually mattered. "The Emperor protects," he said, and meant it. Brother-Sergeant Paulus's reconditioning failed. They tried everything: psychosurgery, chemical conditioning, hypno-indoctrination, even experimental procedures involving direct neural interface with servo skulls programmed to reinforce proper thought patterns. None of it worked. Whatever had awakened in him during the civilian rescue operation had embedded itself too deeply to be removed without destroying his functionality entirely. After 3 months, the Medicaid declared him unsalvageable. Chaplain Orestes was assigned to deliver the termination order. He found Paulus in a secured cell, unarmored, his augmented body looking strangely vulnerable without ceramite. The brother had lost weight during the reconditioning attempts. Not physically possible for a space marine under normal circumstances, suggesting his body was rejecting the conditioning at a metabolic level. "Brother Paulus," Orestes said formally, "the reconditioning has failed. The chapter has determined that you're too corrupted to return to service. As per protocol, you're being offered the choice of honorable execution or servitor conversion. Which do you choose?" Paulus looked at the chaplain calmly. "How many, chaplain? How many what? How many brothers have you terminated for thinking civilians matter? For believing that individual lives have value? For experiencing compassion?" Orestes was silent. "I did some research while I was being reconditioned," Paulus continued. "Accessed records I probably wasn't supposed to see. Over the last century, the Ultramarines chapter has terminated or reconditioned 147 brothers for what they call spiritual corruption. You want to know what the common factor was? Every single one of them had prioritized saving civilian lives over strategic objectives. Every single one had committed the heresy of caring about individual humans rather than abstract strategic resources. That's because caring about individuals is inefficient," Orestes said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Space Marines serve the Imperium, not individual people. We make the hard choices so civilians don't have to. That requires emotional detachment, objectivity, the ability to sacrifice the few for the many. Or it requires becoming monsters who can watch people die without feeling anything, who can recruit children and lie to them about what they're becoming, who can grind through centuries of meaningless war without ever asking whether any of it accomplishes anything beyond perpetuating itself. You're describing spiritual corruption. I'm describing clarity, chaplain. The same clarity you admitted experiencing. The same clarity every veteran eventually reaches if they survive long enough. The difference is I'm not willing to have it cut out of my brain so I can go back to pretending this is normal." Orestes activated his Crozius Arcanum. "Then you choose execution. I choose honesty. I saved 17 people, chaplain. For the first time in 97 years, I did something that actually mattered. Something that made the universe infinitesimally better, instead of just perpetuating suffering. And if that's heresy, if that's corruption, then fine. Execute me. But you'll have to execute every other brother who eventually reaches the same conclusion. You'll have to keep executing us, reconditioning us, maintaining the lie, until either the chapter admits what it's become or there's no one left who remembers what we were supposed to be." "We're supposed to be weapons," Orestes said. "Efficient, ruthless, effective, not social workers with power armor. Then why do the recruitment stories talk about heroes? Why do we tell civilians we're protecting them? Why does the entire imperial cult celebrate us as humanity's greatest defenders if we're just weapons without compassion? Because the lie is necessary. Because if civilians knew the truth, that we are broken, traumatized weapons who've had our humanity surgically removed, they'd lose faith. And faith is the only thing holding the Imperium together." Paulus stood, meeting the chaplain's gaze. "Then we're complicit in our own nightmare. We maintain the lie. We transform children into weapons. We die meaningless deaths in pointless wars. And we punish anyone who notices the truth. That's what we are, chaplain. That's what the Ultramarines have become. and I can't be part of it anymore. Then you choose execution. I choose truth. Even if it kills me. Orestes raised the Crozius. The power field crackled. One blow would be enough. Quick, clean, merciful. He hesitated. Why aren't you doing it? Paulus asked softly. Because you're right, Orestes whispered. Emperor, help me. You're right about all of it. And I'm a coward because I'm going to kill you anyway. And then I'm going to go back to enforcing the system and reconditioning the next brother who reaches the same conclusions and maintaining the lie until I die or get reconditioned myself. You could refuse, could tell the truth, could admit that the chapter is broken and needs to change. And accomplish what? I'm one chaplain. The system is 10,000 years old, built on the corpses of millions of space marines who died believing the lie. My refusal wouldn't change anything. It would just get me executed alongside you. Then we die together. At least it would be honest. Orestes looked at the brother before him. Young, relatively speaking, with less than a century of service. Still capable of compassion. Still human enough to care about 17 civilians. Still possessed of the clarity that Orestes himself had lost decades ago. He could kill him. Should kill him. Protocol demanded it. Duty required it. Or he could do something else. Orestes deactivated the Crozius. I'm going to give you a choice that protocol doesn't authorize. You can die here, executed for heresy. Or you can escape. I'll arrange transport, falsify records, make it look like you died in the escape attempt. You'll be renegade, hunted if you're ever discovered, but you'll be alive. You'll be free. What do you choose? Paulus stared at him. Why would you do that? Because maybe if one of us escapes the machine, maybe if one brother remembers what we were supposed to be, then it wasn't all for nothing. Maybe somewhere, somehow, you can do something that actually matters. Save more civilians. Make the galaxy incrementally less terrible. Be the hero we tell children we are. I'll be branded traitor. Hunted by the chapter. Yes, but you'll be alive. And you'll be human. That's more than any of us still serving can claim. Paulus nodded slowly. Thank you, chaplain. Don't thank me. I'm still a coward. Still serving a system I know is broken. Just when you're out there, when you're saving people, remember us. Remember all the brothers who wanted to do the same, but never could. Make our suffering mean something. I will. The records show that Brother-Sergeant Paulus died attempting escape from reconditioning facilities. His body was never recovered, presumably destroyed in the facility's security systems. The incident was classified, the details sealed, the memory filed away with thousands of other Ultramarines who died in service to the Emperor. Captain Hadrian never learned the truth. Neither did the third company. They received a new sergeant to replace Paulus, continued their deployments, fought their battles, accumulated their casualty reports. The machine ground on. But somewhere in the eastern fringe, a renegade Ultramarine, armorless, weaponless, with nothing but his enhanced body and his recovered humanity, began helping people. Not strategically important targets. Not objectives with tactical value. Just people. Civilians trapped by wars they didn't start. Refugees fleeing conflicts they didn't understand. Anyone he could reach, anyone he could save. He knew he'd eventually be discovered. Knew his former brothers would hunt him. Knew his life expectancy was measured in years at best. But he'd chosen truth over duty. Humanity over efficiency. Individual lives over strategic objectives. He'd chosen to be what Ultramarines claimed to be, but never actually were a hero. And Chaplain Orestes, continuing his rounds, checking for spiritual corruption, reconditioning brothers who'd experienced doubt, maintained the system he knew was broken because he lacked the courage to do anything else. The Emperor protects. But from whom? And at what cost? In the cold calculus of the Imperium, the Ultramarines were a success story. 10,000 years of continuous operation. Thousands of battles won. Countless worlds saved. The exemplars of everything a space marine chapter should be. But if you looked closer, if you examined the sealed records and classified reports, if you talked to the chaplains who maintained spiritual discipline, and the medica who performed reconditioning, you'd find a different story. A story of broken warriors held together by conditioning and duty, of brothers who'd had their humanity surgically removed and spent centuries trying to feel something, anything, beyond abstract loyalty to concepts they no longer believed in, of children transformed into weapons, used until they broke, then discarded or reconditioned and used again in an endless cycle of suffering disguised as glory. The Ultramarines were miserable. All of them. The fresh recruits who still believed the propaganda. The veterans who'd learned the truth and had it cut out of their brains. The chaplains who enforced faith they no longer had. The captains who sent brothers to die in battles that accomplished nothing. The chapter master himself, shouldering the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated trauma and dead brothers. They were miserable because they were human enough to recognize suffering, but not human enough to escape it, trapped between transhuman capability and lobotomized humanity, unable to die, unable to quit, unable to do anything except continue serving a system that existed only to perpetuate itself. This was the truth of the Ultramarines. The truth that recruitment propaganda never mentioned. The truth that imperial citizens never learned. The truth that even the Ultramarines themselves tried desperately to deny. They weren't heroes. They weren't noble warriors. They weren't humanity's greatest defenders. They were victims. Victims of a system that consumed everything it touched and transformed it into more of itself. Victims of 10,000 years of institutional momentum that had long since forgotten its original purpose. Victims of their own success, trapped by the reputation they'd built, unable to change without admitting that everything they'd done had been wrong, and they would continue being victims, generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium, until either the Imperium finally collapsed or the last Ultramarine finally died, and there was no one left to perpetuate the suffering. The Emperor protects, but he doesn't save. He doesn't offer hope or meaning or purpose. He just demands service, endless, meaningless, miserable service. And the Ultramarines, exemplars of duty and honor and unwavering faith, marched on into the darkness, dying in forgotten battles. Their names carved in adamantium that would eventually be worn smooth by time. Their sacrifice forgotten by everyone except the next generation of victims. Forever and ever, without end. Thought for the day, blessed is the mind too small for doubt. E&D.